I now give the floor to Mr. Cameron Hudson.
Thank you, Mr. President, members of the Security Council. I'm grateful for the opportunity to discuss the evolving crisis in Sudan and to offer my perspective as an independent political analyst who has spent nearly 25 years engaged in international efforts to achieve a lasting peace, civilian rule, and enduring stability in this increasingly contested country and region. At no point in Sudan's modern history has the state, its institutions, or its people been under such enormous threat from both internal and external forces. The risk of partition, breakup, and new catastrophic levels of violence and death are real and will be further realized if aggressive actions are not taken to end the fighting. Be assured, the effects of such an outcome will not be confined to Sudan, but will destabilize an already fragile Horn of Africa and send shockwaves of refugees and extremists across the Sahel, the Red Sea, and the Mediterranean. For nearly 1,000 days, Sudan has been under attack. In that time, this body has warned of the risk of mass atrocities and state fracture. But talk of warning ignores what is already happening. The question is whether, when faced with these shocking realities, the international community will cease simply admiring the problem and take measurable actions that impose costs on the perpetrators and their enablers, offer hope to the victims, and compel the parties towards peace. The same question was posed at the start of the war, when the RSF sacked the West Darfur capital of Jenaina in a bout of violence so vicious and intentional that the Biden administration then called it what it was: genocide. Had the world responded to that killing with adequate resolve, perhaps we would not be here today. Instead, we are seeing a severe escalation of this conflict. Since the Rapid Support Forces militia completed their takeover of Al Fasher in October, the truth around what has transpired is only beginning to emerge. Their crimes represent the worst transgressions of this war, and possibly in all of Sudan's modern history. There is simply no comparison. A city of roughly 1 million people a year ago, Al Fasher today has only 70 to 100,000 people remaining. As many as 150,000 are unaccounted for, and thousands, if not tens of thousands, have been killed. The only thing worse than these crimes is knowing that they are not over, and that they will be repeated in the days, weeks, and months ahead if you do not respond. The RSF has now set its strategic sights on the neighboring Kordofan states. The siege there now extends to the cities of Dilling and Kadugli, which are already suffering under a famine declaration. With no food, functioning hospitals, or route out of the cities, these populations now have virtually no means of survival. This begs the question: what possible tactical or strategic reason does the RSF have for targeting civilians after the army has already withdrawn? And what, if any, consequences will they suffer for these blatant war crimes? Left unchecked, in the coming days, an all-out battle for the control of the city of El Obeid, the capital of North Kordofan state, will emerge. This promises to be the largest and perhaps most destructive battle yet, not merely because of the city's strategic location at the country's crossroads, nor because the city now plays host to well over 1 million vulnerable people, but because over the course of the last year, this conflict has been transformed. It has morphed by outside enablers from a conventional 20th century war fought with aging heavy equipment and light arms into a modern 21st century conflict deploying the latest generation of advanced weaponry. The introduction of long-range, tactical, fiber optic, and so-called kamikaze drones, along with sophisticated jamming technology and armored personnel carriers, have replaced the barrel bombs, technicals, and tanks in use at the start of this war. On its surface, smarter weapons should have improved targeting and avoided civilian casualties. But instead, we know that the opposite is true. Civilians, especially those in urban areas, have been subjected to an unrelenting barrage of drone attacks by both sides. Moreover, these weapons have vastly enlarged the scope of the war in ways that respect no battle lines. Every corner of the country is now under threat. Just last week, the northern city of Atbara, hundreds of kilometers from the nearest combat, was barraged in an RSF drone attack targeting an army base, but that knocked out electricity supplies to the eastern part of the country. And just this weekend, a drone attack killed 10 in a market in North Darfur. Weapons from as many as a dozen countries have been found to be in use by both sides in this war, in violation of the 2004 arms embargo. Many of the countries providing weapons actively decry the civilian casualties inflicted by the same arms they provide. Still, other countries providing these weapons sit on this very council. But not all countries bear equal responsibility for fueling this conflict. In the last 2 years, the United Arab Emirates has used influence across the Horn of Africa to construct an extensive military air bridge operation, flying weapons into the RSF via regimes in Chad, Libya, Central African Republic, South Sudan, and Somalia's Puntland region. These efforts have expanded this conflict in ways that have no justification and that are beyond doubt. Mr. President, the situation in Sudan is too dire to accept half-truths and obfuscations about the role outside powers play in fueling this conflict. And it is no longer sufficient to decry the crimes of the belligerents alone. If we ignore the war's enablers, then we are all complicit. Against this backdrop of expanding and unrelenting conflict is the faint prospect of peace. Unfortunately, efforts aimed at curbing this conflict or preparing civilian alternatives have not been nearly as coordinated as efforts to arm the combatants. Recent efforts by the United States to form a quad mechanism of Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates has seen the most high-level attention and offered some hope for a ceasefire, but so far have produced little by way of breakthroughs. The announcement by President Donald Trump to become more personally involved shines a much-needed light on the conflict. Remarks last week by his Secretary of State indicate, however, that the U.S. remains focused on the task of achieving the urgent, near-term goals of a ceasefire and humanitarian access. Make no mistake, these are essential tasks that are welcome and must be prioritized. But it will not be possible to break Sudan's long cycle of violence if we are not equally engaged in pursuit of the fundamental goals of institutional reform and civilian rule. Mr. President, those objectives cannot be achieved through elite bargains alone. It will take a sustained commitment from Sudanese political leaders and the international community, neither of whom have been serious enough in their efforts to present or support realistic civilian alternatives to military rule. But the Sudanese cannot do it alone. Just last week, in a sign of Sudan's tightening civic space, peaceful protesters marking the anniversary of the popular revolution that removed President Omar al-Bashir from power were met with tear gas. Other pro-democracy leaders have been harassed, detained, and even disappeared by recidivist forces within the apparatus who fear the long-term erosion of power. It must be said on this score, the disparate efforts under the African Union and the Secretary General's personal envoy to engage civilian voices have been insufficient to match the urgency of the moment. Nonetheless, these institutions, along with other organizations making up the quintet, remain the best placed to offer opportunities to build broad-based coalitions and heal the social fabric that has been shredded by this war, and create alternatives to rule by force. But those efforts must be unified under a shared mandate. In this regard, we must also not lose sight of the complicated local level, ethnic, social, and resource-based conflict drivers that are too often overlooked in external analyses, but have been exacerbated by this war. In many places, these dynamics drive local violence more than the national or international forces that we focus on. More worrisome still is that these tensions are likely to persist even with an end to the war, and will most assuredly jeopardize any progress toward rebuilding the country if sustained attention is not paid by peacemakers and politicians. Likewise, this Council has been equally remiss in its responsibilities towards the threats to international peace and security in the broader Horn of Africa and Red Sea region. It is unconscionable that the international tools we have to end the conflict, punish the perpetrators, and prevent the expansion by outside actors are all 2 decades old, designed and implemented at a different time for a different conflict. Expanding the arms embargo on Sudan to cover the entire country is an overdue requirement, and genuine efforts should be made to enforce that embargo, which today exists only in the breach. To that end, renewing and expanding UN sanctions on those actors and their accomplices who enable and carry out these crimes of international law must be supported. Talk of condemning impunity rings hollow unless it is backed up by tangible action. And finally, this body must urgently press the International Criminal Court to accelerate its long overdue investigation into the crimes committed at the start of the war, but should also revisit the scope of that mandate that you gave the court 20 years ago to cover all crimes committed in the course of this conflict, not merely those confined to Darfur. Lastly, this body should acknowledge the heroic and irreplaceable work being carried out by Sudan's own mutual aid groups. You should extend to them not only adequate financing to carry out some of the only humanitarian response happening in the country, but offer them greater flexibility in programming to support resiliency and eventually reconstruction efforts. These groups know better than we that which is needed to support their lives and livelihoods. At the same time, ongoing attacks against these groups by the belligerents must be condemned, and this body should extend to these heroes the full protection afforded other organizations under international humanitarian law. Mr. President, Sudan is today on the precipice of state collapse and risks an exodus of refugees and instability that will plague the Horn and Sahelian states for years to come if we allow it to fail. To avoid this outcome, this Council must acknowledge certain hard truths about this war, and even the complicity of many member states who have found profit and strategic advancement in this conflict. This is not simply a civil war between warring generals seeking power and personal aggrandizement. It is a fully internationalized conflict with arms, financial, and political networks extending across continents. In this light, the half measures, diplomatic ambiguity, and paralysis that have defined the international response have done nothing to counter these networks, and in fact have only encouraged the present calamity. If we think that these same networks won't support the region's next war in Chad or South Sudan or Ethiopia, then we are mistaken. Mr. President, Sudan cannot survive if any part of it is governed by a genocidal militia that can challenge the very existence of the state. But nor can it succeed if we allow extremist forces the chance to reemerge and restore their networks of influence that have tormented the region and the people of Sudan for nearly 3 decades. It will take concerted efforts by this body, Sudan's neighbors, and the wider region to pursue an outcome that allow competing interests to be met, the region to be stabilized, while reserving the latitude for Sudan's people to chart their path forward and realize the promise of their revolution. This is no simple task. But if this Council does not signal its intolerance for this war and its many abuses, and take immediate and meaningful steps to curb war crimes and advance the cause of peace, then I fear that Sudan's war will only be the prelude to wider bouts of regional instability to come. There is no time to waste. Thank you, Mr. President.